Good afternoon. I am Fawn Gordon, Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Africana Studies Program in the History Department at UCF. Welcome to the James Weldon Johnson Lecture Series, hosted each fall by the Africana Studies Program. The lecture series is named for James Weldon Johnson, the Florida native son born in Jacksonville in 1871. The panel today, Black Lives Lunch and Learn, UCF alumni and graduate students on race and democracy, is a companion to the UCF Interdisciplinary Black Lives Teach-In held on July 2nd, 2020. Holly Baker, a UCF History BA and MA alumna, is the moderator. She is manager of the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science in Cocoa and co-producer of Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society.
Hi, Dr. Gordon. Thank you so much for that introduction. As Dr. Gordon says, I'm Holly Baker, and I'll be your moderator today for this event. It's called Black Lives Lunch and Learn, UCF alumni and graduate students on race and democracy. Today's presentations will be from alumni and graduate students from the College of Arts and Humanities, the UCF History Department, and the Interdisciplinary Studies Program. And today's Lunch and Learn will be live streamed to YouTube from the UCF History Department's YouTube channel, and will be recorded for later viewing. And today's Lunch and Learn will be divided into two mini sessions. The first mini session, each speaker, well, actually all of the mini sessions, each speaker will have 8 minutes for their presentations. And I'm asking that the speakers not exceed their 8 minutes to make sure that all the speakers have time. And if you're using Zoom to access today's event and you have questions, you can place them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll take questions from the audience after each mini session. And so we have a great group of speakers with us today. And so let me introduce them for you. We have Zafirios Daglaris, who will present the Minstrel legacy of sentimentalism. We have Jennifer Davis, who will discuss how change started to come, examining rhythm and blues and Southern identity. And then we have Aarron Booker, who will share his presentation on Teach Us How, Love, Relationships, and Resistance. So let's begin with Zafirios Daglaris. He received his MA in History from the UCF History Department in the spring of 2020. His research examines the material culture of the color line in North America, which he describes as the power of objects to construct race within an American cultural economic complex. He hopes to continue his work at the PhD level, where he hopes to expand the project with a reading of recent digital humanities scholarship and a consideration of racialized knowledge production in the new media space. So here is Zafirios Daglaris with his presentation, The Minstrel Legacy of Sentimentalism.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Dr. Gordon. So my thesis examined the cultural legacy of blackface minstrelsy over the course of the 20th century, focusing on the United States context in the early sections and expanding in the final chapter to examine an international context. I argued that this minstrel legacy was itself caught up in the legacy of 19th century sentimentalism, from which it absorbed many of its identificatory processes and modes of affordance. These processes largely defined the terms of US politics during the antebellum period, but quickly fell out of the mainstream of political discourse in the years after the war. Author Mary G. DeYoung has characterized sentimentalism as a protean rhetorical mode, rather than constituting a distinct genre. She describes it as a kind of empathetic appeal based on an imagined continuity of sentiment with an other, or what Glenn Hendler terms a fantasy of experiential equivalence. So there is an important paradox to note within sentimentalism. At the same time that it worked to colonize the imaginary register of identification, it also depended on a certain constituent ambiguity or gap between symbols and subjects to maintain the formal terms or integrity of its space. Of course, this describes basically the ambiguities present in virtually all forms of symbolic formation. What sets sentimentalism apart are the contingent historical terms which shaped and were shaped by these processes, including constructions of the home, comfort, empathy, and within the space of a sentimentalized minstrelsy, constructions of race. Likewise, DeYoung describes a complex of sentimental principles, that is, a material, interacting set of ideational and economic terms which reinforce the place of the sentimental rhetorical mode in the mainstream of political discourse, and whose, to quote, Unifying effects led to shared views and feelings, which were widely credited in the antebellum period with generating a national family. Author Eric Lott, in turn, characterizes minstrelsy as directly emerging from this sentimental complex, and because it absorbed many of its relational processes, occupying a similar rhetorical mode. For Lott, 19th century minstrelsy was a deeply ambiguous affair, with, at least in its early days, dehumanizing and dignifying depictions of African Americans often competing with one another in the same representational space. To quote Lott, underwritten by envy as well as repulsion, sympathetic identification as well as fear, the minstrel show continually transgressed the color line, even as it made possible the formation of a self-consciously white working class. Thus, though through its association with or within the sentimental complex, minstrelsy became an important political space where the experiential terms of race and racism would be decided and constructed, but within which a certain ambiguity would continue. Then, in the wake of the devastation of the Civil War, the complex was pushed to a breaking point, causing the flaws and gaps in sentimentalism to become evident and speakable, and to lose their direct political currency. Nevertheless, a subtle influence continued. As a dynamic set of precedented, relational, and associative terms, the complex held an object agency or power over the terms of North American cultural discourse. For author Jennifer Van Horn, objects' power originates from the cumulative spaces of their association, from which they gather their ability to assemble the social. In other words, their power comes from their relational place within a complex. Furthermore, the reproduction of such power does not always occur on the conscious level. Even if most public discourse no longer went through sentimentalism, many people still felt compelled by its tropes and continued to associate them with especially matters of death, mourning, and loss. Of course, since Freud's discovery of the unconscious and later on the repetition automatism, we know that the manner by which an individual approaches death negatively says something about their approach to life. In this way, the lingering sentimental complex gained an even more immediate proximity to the site of white identity formation as a fleeting set of relations that negatively structured the entire field. One can find in virtually any selection from the period of classic Hollywood film, for instance, all the hallmarks of the sentimental rhetorical mode in these films' dynamics of affordance and identification, which are always anchored in a certain cultural approach to death. In fact, Lott argues that minstrelsy maintained a similar type of currency in US cultural discourse. Most vital products of US cultural life, he notes, depend on, enact in their innermost workings, modes of production of racialized cultural value, end quote. To explain this phenomenon, Lott broadly brings together Edward Said's characterization of the other with Jacques Lacan's object cause of desire. That is, to get at the vicissitudes of desire for the other, and to explain how the social dynamic of Black marginalization is reproduced, at least in part, via this paradoxical minstrel identificatory dynamic. Here, finally, is my historiographical contribution. I argue that, in addition to Said's conception of the other, we should also consider Lacan's notion of the concept, generally referred to as the big other. For Lacan, the big other is an inherent byproduct of signification, owing to what Joan Kopchak calls the opacity of the signifier. It is a perception of personhood and the material agency of signifiers, a constitutive third party to performance which compels our cultural involvement. And importantly, it is that empty gaze, staring back from the abyss of culture that paradoxically founds the sentimental fantasy of experiential equivalence. For Lott, Blackness functioned throughout the 20th century as a kind of theatrical prop used to stabilize white identity. That is, as an attempt to account for the Freudian lost object, which is lost when subjects are constituted during their entrance into language. For Lott, whites use African Americans in an attempt to fill that constitutive lack, to account for its absence. Thus, African Americans have been caught continuously since the dawn of minstrelsy in the chimeric gaps set by the object cause of desire within the white gaze. But what psychoanalytic terms explain this continuity? I argue that, via the overlapping legacies of sentimentalism and minstrelsy, that is, through their very fleeting quality, lingering object agency, and most importantly, relational dimension during the 20th century, Blackness came to take the place, not just of Said's other, but of Lacan's other, becoming the phantasmatic audience to which white cultural performance is directed and depends upon. Lott's account looks at disparate, discrete examples of white minstrel identification over the course of the 20th century. In doing so, he takes as fundamental to contemporary cultural production Blackness being caught up in white desires. My thesis pushes back here. While I agree that there is something fundamental to language about desire and otherness, Blackness very simply does not have to occupy this space. There is a possibility of decoupling Blackness from the place of the other. By drawing on Lacan's clinical interventions, my thesis holds out hope that a new relation with the other can be forged. Such an approach would necessarily work in tandem with the two other major anti-racist praxis, economic/social intervention and education, but would additionally confront the lingering experiential terms of the antebellum economy. By giving people the tools to confront the lingering terms of the antebellum economy, by giving people the tools to locate and confront the phantasmatic, racialized audience that motivates their performance, this experience of a Black big other in our social link from which the repressed of racism returns, my thesis argues that psychoanalysis can help affect a shift in the terms of the racialized social link, to help racialized subjects experience that the gaze of the Black big other does not see them and that it does not exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zafirios Daglaris, for your presentation. Now we're turning to Jennifer Davis. Jennifer Davis's research interest focuses on the South, African Americans, and Southern identity. She completed her undergrad degree at Florida State University, and she pursued her master's at the University of Central Florida, where she was encouraged to engage and pursue in different notions of how history can be practiced. How change started to come is the culmination of her time at UCF and seeks to challenge the historical record on Black Southern identity. So here is Jennifer Davis in her presentation, How Change Started to Come, Examining Rhythm and Blues and Southern Identity.
I want to start by thanking Holly for the introduction and the entire staff within the UCF History Department for their work and kindness, and also extend a thanks to Dr. Gordon and Africana Studies for hosting this lecture and allowing me to be a guest. And then I have to give a special thanks to both Dr. Lester and Dr. Lyons, who I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. So I was once a graduate student with no real idea of what my thesis ought to be and had no real prospects. But then an unexpected identity crisis struck me when Beyonce Giselle Knowles-Carter released Lemonade. I was confronted with the notion that I might be a Southerner, something I had never considered, even though I was born in the South, attended college in the South, and had always lived in a Southern state. The crux of my crisis was being unsure if the term Southerner even applied to Black people, or if Black people ever claimed to be Southerners. From the ashes of my identity crisis, a thesis idea emerged. Are Black people Southerners? Spoiler alert, yes, they are. And if so, and we know that they are, why hasn't the term Southerner been more broadly applied to include Black people? And what can R&B music tell us about how Black Southerners have chosen to stake a claim on their version of the South? For the focus of this lecture, I didn't want to talk about the erasure of Black people. I wanted to focus on Black Southerners and how they saw identity and why I think R&B music is worth considering. Historian L.D. Reddick surmised that the Negro in the South was, quote, a study in attachment and alienation, noting identification has always been a problem, that though he might not have preferred the term, the objective fact was that he was a Southerner. Reddick continues by saying, there is no singular path for Black people to embrace or reject their Southern identity, with the reality being that Black Southerners, quote, alternate between love and hate, while few seem capable of loving and hating at the same time. Zora Neale Hurston, in an essay, wrote Black Southerners had been portrayed through two narratives. The first was that of the simple Negro, and second was the Negro sharecropper who cried out at the injustice. Hurston believed that such narrow characterizations had stigmatized Blacks as being devoid of emotional nuance. She believed that through folklore, Blacks could recast themselves, and that folklore allowed Blacks to be seen as neither exceptional nor quaint. R&B music is different than any other genre of Black music. It hasn't been written about in nearly as much depth as other seminal genres like blues or even rap music has been. R&B also seems to exist in our collective conscience without direct ties to a region. It just sort of has always been there. I knew that a large part in examining R&B music would be the deconstruction of both blues and gospel music. In tracing these two genres, I would have a more complete picture of the Black South and Black Southern identity, basically from the start of the 20th century up through the Civil Rights Movement circa 1968. The role of Black music is to translate everyday experiences into living sound. Music is how Black Americans have pushed back against the social death in America, serving equal part outlet and shelter in navigating the trauma of being Black and living in America. Blues music confronted the reality of the hardship faced in a world not far removed from slavery. The blues were simply just the facts of life. Listening to the blues meant you were never suffering alone, but the blues also highlighted the growing divide between the Black middle class and Black working class. Blues was seen as a Black working class music, and as if it was tied too closely to slavery, and the Black middle class was trying to move on and sort of move past it. It also intersected arguments put forward by two of the most prominent thinkers of the day, in Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. The blues ethos was one of individuality that had never been expressed to such an extent in previous iterations of Black music, but blues artists can be categorized as a part of Du Bois' idea of the talented 10. And while blues artists and blues music didn't offer solutions about what Black Southerners ought to do in terms of gaining full citizenship status, it did provide a solace for those who took part in listening. Gospel music underwent a complete sound transformation during the 1940s. The 40s, a time in which African Americans across America were optimistic about the state of American democracy and what could happen on the backs of World War II, with the idea of the double V, victory at home and abroad. A former bluesman by the name of Thomas A. Dorsey completely reshaped the sound of what we now recognize as modern gospel music. Dorsey created his own style, which was blues style of gospel that blended secular tempo and sacred lyrics. Dorsey created music that came from the Black world he lived in, while his lyrics came from the hope of the Christian message. Gospel music centered on being personal and purposeful, with hope and affirmation at its core. And within Black mainstream churches, there was an acceptance of high energy and freedom of expression that had previously been looked down upon. And throughout the South, we had only really seen experience in the holiness movement and Pentecostal churches that were most commonly attended by poor and rural Black folks. Another example of the sort of class divide that's often not as well documented within the Black South. Call and Response offers a quick glimpse of how blues and gospel intertwined to create R&B. In blues, the call and response happened and referred to the in-between of an artist and their instrument. In gospel, it happened between a performer, the choir, and the congregation. And in R&B music, it happened between the artist and the audience at a concert. When R&B emerges in the 1950s, it's within the context of over 750,000 Black Southerners migrating to cities from the countryside. It's the sound that emerges from living in segregated cities. Arnold Shaw called R&B music Black ghetto music. It was hearing Black radio DJs and hearing Black-oriented programming across the South. And in some major Southern cities, it was having access to a Black-only radio station. R&B embraced vulgarity. It linked the spiritual and the sexual. Ray Charles described it as, quote, pure heart singing, the same mixture of blues and gospel with maybe a sweet melody thrown in for good measure. The ethos of R&B was how it connected the social function of the Black church with the attitudes of the Black working class. Brian Ward wrote of R&B, quote, it was the sound of a radical democratic vision of the individual identities realized and proudly asserted within the context of sustaining a collective culture. I know R&B emerges at the height of the civil rights movement, and I know historians have written about freedom songs and their importance within the movement. I don't contest that. I'm simply looking outside those particular moments of protest. And R&B isn't the sound of a protest. It's the sound of an entire social movement, not because of any one song or any artist, because it's a constant companion and carries the stories of the past with the sounds of the current struggle. Finally, Alan Locke once remarked the conditions of the South weren't conducive to development of Negro self-expression, and if conditions changed, then a new literature of the South would spring to life. I'd argue music is that form of literature. Some of the best and most influential Black Southern writers have been musicians. I'm not proclaiming R&B music is the best solution to more fully understanding Black Southern identity. I do think it's incumbent upon historians to find Black Southern voices and know that plenty can be found in R&B music. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your wonderful presentation. Now we're going to hear from Aarron Booker. Aarron Booker is a first-year graduate student originally from South Central Los Angeles, California. As a master's in interdisciplinary studies, his current research interest centers on finding an interdisciplinary method of integrating love in its applicable forms to classroom cultures as well as different groups of individuals. So here is Aarron Booker in his presentation, Teach Us How, Love, Relationships, and Resistance.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aarron Booker. I am a graduate student out of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Central Florida with an expected graduation date of spring 2020. So my research is, in a brief overview, an attempt to look at how love can function as a means to change classroom culture, interpersonal experiences, and the way that we tell narratives to one another. You're going to transition for me, whether you want to. Yay. So typically, I would start an icebreaker, but because we don't have the time to do that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce a quote to you all instead. So this quote is taken from the James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni interview that's began its resurgence popularity recently. It was featured in a music video, I want to say last week, but this is the end of the video. After an intense discussion between Giovanni and Baldwin, Giovanni says, that becomes a responsibility, doesn't it? To which Baldwin retorts, well, let's call it love. Love is a tremendous responsibility. It's the only one worth taking. So when we talk about love, oftentimes we talk about love in the context of a feeling. But Sharon Salzberg in her book, Real Love, the mindfulness practice, states that love is not a feeling, it is an ability. To which Bell Hooks echoes in her seminal work earlier in 2000 that love is an ability. She uses the definition by Scott Peck to define love as the will to extend one's self-worth, oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another spiritual growth. Love is as love does. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention of action. Will also implies choice. We don't have to love, we choose to love. In an interview with Sharon, Bell Hooks continues to break down love further into 6 core components: care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. Each of these being essential to the act of loving. If you ask yourself, what am I doing for X, Y, and Z, and you cannot determine whether one of these components is missing, you're not doing that action out of love, you're doing it out of selfishness. But in a conversation with John Powell, Bell Hooks also tells us that love is about community, and community brings connection, and connection fosters a sense of belonging. And as we are all trying to figure out where we belong in each of our communities, the idea that love can help foster that understanding becomes powerful in its own regard. Because as Dr. King wrote in one of his sermons out of the collection in 1963, love has a capacity, or love carries the power to deconstruct binaries. Breaking down the us and them binary is the work of love. So what do interdisciplinarians have to gain by studying love? Well, we will begin to answer this question by looking at what each discipline and their subdisciplines can examine from this particular phenomenon. So in this context, love will be a heuristic. it wouldn't be the answer to a problem. It would be a guide. You can use love as a method to arriving towards a solution as opposed to the solution itself. After you figure out what discipline has a vested interest, you can use their existing bodies of knowledge to study what they've looked at up to this point in time, and then begin to develop new knowledge to be integrated into those existing bodies. For example, love, or at least a love politic, has been seen in second wave Black feminism. Black feminists push this idea of a love politic. It's this idea that love is a method of resistance, whether that be in self-care or understanding the difference between yourself, other feminists, other womanists, so on and so forth. For example, Alice Walker uses the phrase loves herself regardless. Regardless is italicized because self-love is absolutely essential. That it persists in spite of everything. We have motion lights, and so if I don't move around, they go down. So self-love, it seems, is the only love that must always exist. It is the love that enables the other loves, Walker's womanism, bodies, and genders and relishes. Moving forward, Audre Lorde uses a love politic in stating that it is a method of turning away from terror and loathing. It allows you to take a deep dive into a deep place of knowledge that has to be touched, meaning that self-love is important to going into those dark places that you'll be able to produce not only new knowledge from, but even the change of self as well. And then June Jordan, she emphasizes self-love, the undertaking and embracing of difference, not only in community, but from a political standpoint as well. Lorde and Jordan both suggest that the labor of crafting and collective construction around difference requires a serious undertaking. The task of working on, or perhaps even against, the self, meaning that despite what you may believe in the current moment, oftentimes love means that you're going to act both in your best interest and against your best interest at the same time, not in tandem of putting yourself in danger, but in challenging a perspective that wouldn't be conducive to understanding knowledge as a whole. So what's next for me? So over the course of my graduate career, I intend to explore the ways that love can be utilized to craft new narratives in Black lives. I want to examine this idea of a love politic and how it can operate in spaces for Black folks, Black people, to use their existing bodies of knowledge and then figure out from there what they can learn outside of that and then integrate it back into their lives, and then hopefully benefit the lives of other Black people moving forward. I also want to figure out how to take this idea of a love politic and integrate it into classrooms so that teachers can use the 6 components that Hooks talks about in a classroom environment to teach students not only love as an ability, but love and capacity that they can learn to love themselves over time as well. And then this is my contact information. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Aarron Booker. Now that concludes our first mini session, and now we're going to take audience questions. Reminder, if you're using Zoom to access today's event and you have questions, please place them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Our first question is for Zafirios. You mentioned that minstrelsy is ambiguous. To whom is it ambiguous, and what exactly do you mean by that term?
I'm really happy this question was asked because it's a very kind of important concept to minstrelsy. Minstrelsy has been characterized as ambiguous by several different scholars, David Roediger, Eric Lott, W.T. Lehman. Of course, looking back, there's a part of it doesn't seem ambiguous at all. And minstrelsy helped create racism, like, right? It helped codify racism. But the process of codifying racism involved ambiguous elements for the audience of minstrelsy and for the minstrel performers themselves. So there was a kind of paradox in the way that audience and cast members would identify with African Americans, on some level authentically enjoy the music, the culture, but then at the same time want to otherize, want to, you know, codify Black culture as something, either what minstrels would do, looking back, is that things that whites kind of liked would be codified as white, and other things would be kind of projected onto African Americans, negative psychological things. There's a lot of work on that. So I would just finish with one quote from Eric Lott, who wrote the book Love and Theft, which is a very important book on minstrelsy. The Black mask offered a way to play with collective feels of a degraded and threatening and male other, while at the same time maintaining some symbolic control over them. Yet the intensified American fears of succumbing to a racialized image of otherness were everywhere operative in minstrelsy, continually exceeding the controls and accounting, paradoxically, for the minstrel show's power, insofar as its Blackness was unceasingly fascinating to performers and audiences alike. So fascinating. They were at the same time fascinated by it and repulsed by it. You know, they were creating racism. And I argue that those ambiguous feelings, racial feelings, can be seen in the legacy of minstrelsy in the 20th century culture industry. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zafirios. You actually have another question. Someone is asking, in what way do you see modern day minstrelsy informing the public about Black identity? For you, Zafirios. The second question is, in what way do you...
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'll repeat the question just in case. In
Yeah.
what way do you see modern day minstrelsy informing the public about Black identity?
Well, it's really not Black identity. It's the way that whites kind of create white identity in relation to Africans, like African Americans, or not even African American culture. What is kind of labeled African American culture, like within the kind of mainstream of discourse, right? So there's a lot of kind of ambiguities in terms of like cultural genealogy too, right? Like nothing really can so easily be traced back to the old world, because the legacies of the old world, the cultural legacies, are caught up in so many power struggles over the centuries, right? So they don't mean, there's always kind of an unconscious racialized element, right? That's as things exist in the dominant white gaze, right?
Great, thank you, Zafirios, for that. We have a question for Jennifer Davis. The question is, please talk about the ways in which Beyonce Knowles' Lemonade gave new meaning to Black Southern identity.
I love this question. Thank you. Shout out to whoever asked it. I think that what Beyonce was really able to do with Lemonade was she basically just cast the entire thing in within the Black South. I mean, that's where it was placed. And I think that she did a really important thing of sort of showing both kind of the city street aspect that she had kind of grown up with in Houston and had roots in New Orleans and Louisiana, while also showing this really rich cultural text of what Black lives and Black living look like in the country. And in those sort of moments, she was very much enraptured with her own family and sort of multiple generations of, the Carter Knowles clan, as well as kind of embracing younger Black women. And I think that Beyonce was able to show that it's very much because it's that she's from Houston and that she has lineage in New Orleans, that she was, she is who she is. I think it's, we can all kind of fairly assume that, like, if Beyonce was born in Portland, Oregon, I don't even know if we know who Beyonce is, or like what that music sounds like, or if she ever makes Lemonade, because so much about Lemonade was, staking a claim and being proud of not just who you are as a Black woman, but all of the, Black women that you've ever known, like friendship wise, and also, like your mother, your grandmother, and that ancestor lineage. And I think that she did it in a way that wasn't completely, depressing or, for a white audience. It was her story, our story, and we all kind of embraced it and loved it.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that answer. We have one more question for this mini session, and it's for Aarron Booker. The question is, have you considered engaging scholars in Black queer studies to rethink a love politics for all Black people and more encompassing view in genders and sexualities through the erotic power, erotic autonomy, such as thinking about Jackie Alexander, Jafari Sinclair Allen, and Audre Lorde, all in Black feminism tradition as you seek?
So the short answer to your question is yes, but in doing so, I found myself existing in this touchy space. Because when it comes to Black queer folks, the more you shed light on them, oftentimes the more they're exposed to various forms of violence. And that includes both intellectual and physical acts, spiritual, so on and so forth. And doing what I've done so far, the line I've treaded was making sure that people know where the knowledge comes from and that my voice is not coming across louder than anyone else's. So yes, I would love to, but I know that I'm going to once I figure out how to walk alongside the work and figure out how to deconstruct a binary, or at least remove the Western thought from notions of love, similar to how Sharon and Belle have done, or how John Powell and Belle have always talked about removing the other from the situation. There's something there for me that needs to be removed before I can get there.
Thank you so much, Aarron, for your answer. I want to thank the first group of panelists for their time: Zafirios, Daglaris, Jennifer Davis, and Aarron Booker. Thank you so much. And also want to thank the folks who turned in those awesome questions for our panelists. Now we're moving on to mini session 2. Our remaining speakers are Brandon Nightingale, who will discuss the CME Church in the memory of the Civil Rights Movement, and Porsha Dossie, who will join us to present The Tragic City. So we're going to start with Brandon Nightingale. He is the archival coordinator and adjunct professor of African American history at Bethune-Cookman University, a historically Black university in Daytona Beach, Florida, where he oversees the research and the archives at the university and its founder, Mary Macleod Bethune. Brandon serves as the communications manager for the Association of African American Museums, Emerging Museum Professionals Leadership Committee, and he is finishing his MS degree from Florida State University in December. Here is Brandon Nightingale and his presentation, The CME Church in the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement.
Thank you, Holly. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you all today for this James Weldon Johnson lecture series. I'm going to actually remove my video. I really want the focus to be on the PowerPoint presentation. So once again, like I said, thank you, Holly, for the introduction. Today, I will be discussing the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in the memory of the Civil Rights Movement. The CME Church is a historically Black church rooted in the South that was established in 1870. The church has been viewed historically as an old slavery church due to its close relationship to the white Methodist Episcopal Church, formerly Methodist Episcopal Church South. The history of the denomination encouraged the view that CME churches and schools had not been active in the civil rights movement. Closer research into the denomination's archives from 1954, when the church changed its name from colored to Christian, up to the 1970s, when the movement transitioned, challenges that interpretation. From the individual activist leaders across the South to CME-affiliated historically Black colleges associated with the Black student movement and the work of the members of local congregations, the CME Church can be shown to have been at the forefront of the movement. By focusing on 4 CME leaders, I argue that activism took many forms, narrowly defining what constitutes civil rights activism, risk overlooking important figures in the movement, and failing to acknowledge the struggles individuals and church communities face in the struggle to end disenfranchisement and Jim Crow segregation. On March 17, 1965, a famous photo that you can see here on the screen of a man marching alongside Ralph Abernathy, James Foreman, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and civil rights legend John Lewis, who we recently lost this past July. The photograph is associated with the marches that took place during the civil rights movement in the United States, as it shows activists and leaders of the movement in solidarity. Reverend Jesse L. Douglas Sr., who was labeled in the photo as an unidentified white man, appears to be white, but he is not. He was a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Board for many years. He helped organize citizens for marches, including the 47-mile-long Selma to Montgomery March. His voice carried tunes that set the tone for many of Dr. King's soul-stirring sermons and speeches. The efforts on behalf of Reverend Douglas Sr. of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church played an important part in the American Civil Rights Movement. Douglas is symbolic of the CME Church. His skin color, as well as his activism within his own community, embodies the history of the CME Church. In placing the CME Church in the discussion of the civil rights movement, 3 men stand out as examples of leaders who devoted their time and resources to accomplish the goals of ending legalized racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination in the United States on behalf of African Americans. Bishop Randall Albert Carter to the far left, Dr. Channing Hedgie Tobias in the middle, and Bishop Henry Clay Bunton of the CME Church exemplified the importance of religious leadership in the civil rights movement. Their leadership highlights the broad fight for civil rights, and their contributions focused on distinct institutional and public areas of reform. Each of these 3 men had a relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded the university I am at today in 1904. And I will be touching on this as I highlight some of their stories. From its founding in 1870, the CME Church avoided political issues and participation in social action. This position became established within the denomination, most likely because the church wanted to stay in good relations with the Methodist Episcopal Church South, who in return for what whites perceived as responsible behavior, transferred portions of their church property to the newly established CME Church and provided other assistance in organizing separate church services. In 1910, 40 years after the CME Church was founded, soon-to-be Bishop Randall Albert Carter counseled the CME Church in its relationship to Southern whites. In a quote, he says, "It is better to stay on friendly, amicable relations with the best white people of the South," end quote, adding, quote, "The colored Methodist Episcopal Church, or the colored Methodist Church in its close relations with the Methodist Episcopal Church South holds the key to the racial situation in the South," end quote. Leaders of the CME Church felt their survival was dependent upon the relationship to the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Carter, born January 1st, 1867 in Fort Valley, Georgia, to parents Tobias and Grace Carter. In 1844, he finished Allen University High School in Columbia, South Carolina, and was an ordained minister in the CME conference of that state in 1887. That year, he entered CME-affiliated Payne College and became the first and only graduate in the class of 1891. Payne College was founded by the leadership of the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1882. Bishop Carter's ministerial career prior to 1914, when he was elected to the bishop, was spent largely in Georgia, where he served several pastorates, but chiefly as presiding elder under Bishop L.H. Hosley. For many years, he was behind the scenes as an advisor to Bishop Hosley, who bestowed his blessings. A proud member of the Association for the Study of Negro Life, now known as ASALA, founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the Journal of Negro History released a short piece on Carter in April of 1954, just a month after he passed away. I want to briefly read a quote from that piece, and it says, Bishop Carter represented the stalwart leadership of colored people, predominantly ministerial since the Civil War, who chose him from their vital interest in uncompromising loyalty would never be questioned. His words in the tribute to the slaughter victims of the Chicago riots of 1919 and in support of the heroic defenders who survived are eloquent. He did not serve at any time as a special assistant advisor on Negro affairs because he loathed opportunities who seek publicity and profit by bartering their people down the river. And just briefly, I want to point out what's on the screen here. At the top, you'll see he was a part of the first Episcopal District Colored Methodist Church, which is the CME Church. And he's actually talking about when Mary McLeod Bethune left the president at the college. Mary McLeod Bethune, she was the president of the organization from 1936 to 1951. And so I did want to share that. And this is coming straight from the archives at Bethune-Cookman University. One of the first outspoken leaders on civil rights issues within the CME Church was Channing Hedgie Tobias, prominent civil rights leader. And he was the secretary of the Colored Department of National Council of Young Men's Christian Association, also called the YMCA, from 1911 to 1946. He was one of the first African Americans to serve as director of the Phelps Stokes Fund and on the board of trustees of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, and later became its chairman in 1953. Tobias was heavily involved with the CME Church. He received his BA from Payne College in 1902, and he was ordained in the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in 1911. And so I just want to quickly focus on what's on the screen here. Here you'll see where Dr. Tobias was writing Mary, and at the top you'll see it comes from the National Council of Young Men's Christian Association, which Channing was over. And in the photo to the right, you'll see a photo of Walter White, who was affiliated with the NAACP, Mary McLeod Bethune in the middle, and Dr. Tobias to the far right. And lastly, I want to focus on Henry Clay Bunton. Henry Clay Bunton was born on October 19, 1903 in Coker, Arkansas. By the time Bunton turned 20, he made the decision to join the CME Church. In his commitment to the church, Bunton adopted the values and principles that had sustained the denomination. Education was a top priority, especially for men like Bunton who felt called to the ministry. Despite a late start, Bunton attended CME-affiliated Miles College in Birmingham, Alabama at the age of 22. By 1925, he joined the military, and 5 years later, he would become an ordained elder within the CME Church. After traveling the world, representing the CME Church through education and ministry, Bunton was moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1954. He would take on the challenge to perform pastoral duties at Mount Olive Cathedral CME Church, one of the largest and most prestigious churches in Memphis. During his residence in Memphis, Bunton became active in the struggle for civil rights, and soon he would become a household name in the city. And I know I'm running out of my time here, so I just want to briefly highlight what's on your screen here. So this is a letter from Bishop Bunton to Mrs. Bethune, and you'll see, I really want to point out the letterhead because you can see the church picture at the top, and then to the far right, this is the picture of what the church currently looks at. And so this is my presentation. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you so much, Brandon Nightingale, for your presentation. Next, we have Porsha Dossie. Porsha Dossie is a writer, a cultural steward, and an emerging public historian specializing in Black history, urban studies, and the post-war era. Her scholarship and teaching examines race, immigration, and civil rights in the 20th century U.S. South. Porsha's other research interests include racial equity and representation in cultural institutions, cultural resource management, museums, and historic preservation. She is currently a staff historian in the National Park Service, Office of the Chief Historian in Washington, D.C., where she helps to manage the African American Civil Rights Network. Here is Porsha Dossie and her presentation, The Tragic City.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Dr. Gordon and Tiffany and your entire team for putting this together and allowing me to be here. I often joked after I finished my thesis that I would never talk about it again. And unfortunately, I have had to because the topic has remained relevant since I completed it in 2018. And so I want to stop here and actually hold space for us to acknowledge Walter Wallace Jr. and Aarron Hilton, who both lost their lives to police violence recently. And it's interesting that we continue to have these conversations because what made me write my thesis, The Tragic City, was Philando Castile and Alton Sterling also losing their lives to police violence in 2016. You know, I, like millions of other people, logged into Facebook and watched Philando Castile be murdered in front of his girlfriend and her child. And trying to process that with my mom, she brought up Arthur Mcduffie and what happened in 1980 in Miami, because she lived through that and she saw those similarities. So that is my way of starting this presentation, and I hope that I can share my research questions and my conclusions as to what ultimately led Black Miami to rebel in 1980, and also why we don't talk about it in the context of the civil rights movement and ongoing Black freedom struggle. So I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. I'm not sure. Tiffany, I may need your assistance. Can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it perfectly, Porsha.
Okay, thank you. So my thesis was entitled The Tragic City, Black Rebellion and the Struggle for Freedom in Miami, 1945 to 1990. This is an excerpt from a poem that I used throughout my thesis. A line from a poem opened each of the chapters. So this was written by Hakeem Ajamil, who was a prisoner at Fort Leavenworth in 1993 when he wrote this retrospective on Mcduffie's passing. His brain was bashed, cranium crashed, skull fractured, broken, all the way around. But they said those who beat him didn't kill him. So who killed Mcduffie? If you all are not familiar with Arthur Mcduffie and ultimately the Mcduffie, I term it as a rebellion or uprising, but at the time it was known as the Mcduffie Riots. Arthur Mcduffie was a Black insurance salesman who was riding his motorcycle in Miami in December of 1979. He ran a stoplight, police pursued him, and when they caught up to him, they beat his head in with billy clubs and Kel lights, these very large flashlights. And ultimately he died of his injuries. There was a cover-up for several months that basically came to light. And at that point, there was a trial. And unfortunately, the officers that were involved in his death were acquitted, which led to a massive rebellion where Miami burned for 3 days and 3 nights, and there was outright street warfare in places like Overtown and Liberty City. And this sounds very familiar, right? When we look at police violence today, you can see kind of those connections, unfortunately. So when I was thinking about this thesis topic, and I formulated these questions as I completed my readings. And so I basically argue in The Tragic City that in the post-civil rights era, Jim Crow didn't disappear because it met its legal demise. Instead, it really modernized, it innovated through the advent of a series of events and policies ushered in by globalization, World War II, and the US government's Cold War policies. This led to an ethnic reordering, which irrevocably shifted the balance of power in Miami. And so as a result of these processes, Miami's Black population, which already hung at the lowest rung of society, is even more disenfranchised by this process because the gains of the civil rights movement that's happening in other places is not taking place in Miami because the federal government, in its war against the USSR and this war of optics, decides to support white Cuban exiles and leaves the Black community out to dry. So within these questions, I had 4 major questions that I tried to address, and I'm sure I'm running out of time, unfortunately, so I'll make this pretty brief. But just trying to understand the role of the federal government and intervention in housing policies and how that impacted where Black folks could live and their economic opportunities. My second question was trying to understand the role of Cuban immigration in Miami's contentious racial climate. So how did the Cuban coalition with Miami's white leaders, and more broadly their relationship with the federal government, reflect and contribute to animosity in Miami's Black community? My third question was trying to understand how white Cuban exiles during the 1960s were treated versus how Haitian refugees and Afro-Cubans were treated when they came over in the 1970s and 1980s, respectively. And finally, why did law enforcement become the primary method of social control after World War II? How did this lead to an increase in surveillance of Black ghettos and Black people? So my findings. Civic elites, both Black and white, took part in really exciting government programs that sounded really good on paper, but in practice were destructive. So the New Deal's Homeowners Loan Corporation basically led to redlining, which I'm not going to get into now because we don't have the time, but I'm happy to talk about in more details if there are questions. And maybe more well-known, urban renewal and the state highway building program in the 1950s and 60s. So the nucleus of Miami's Black community was in Colored Town. You all may know it now as Overtown if you're familiar. But at the time, Overtown was destroyed because of the construction of I-95. Colored Town was a blight, and so to get rid of it and move Miami into modernity, it was destroyed and the Black community there displaced. Cuban exiles, for question 2, were given preferential treatment by the federal government because of the Cold War. So while the US government was not happy about Cuban exiles coming, they were willing to treat them differently than they had previous refugees in a way to say, look at how awful Castro is, look at how bad communism is, look at how wonderful capitalism is, and how we are a real democracy, even though Black people continue to have no rights and are killed with impunity in our country because it's 1961. So that kind of anti-communist sentiment that was prevalent at the time, actually, while it was able to help Cuban exiles, it was to the detriment of Black civil rights orgs, because if you were a member of the NAACP or the Urban League or CORE or SNCC, you had to deal with anti-communist hysteria, because if you were a part of those orgs, you must have been a communist. And so the federal government, state governments, local governments were less inclined to support your endeavors. So question 3, the Cuban exiles that came over first were mostly white and upper or middle class. Those who came in the 1980s were poor, they were darker skin or Afro-Cubans. And so this quote is from a woman who talks about how the existing Cuban exile community in Miami rejected her and other Marielitos because they did not fit that community's idea of a respectable exile or refugee. So that becomes compounding because they also enter the country with the Haitian refugee community, which is not treated well at all, and many are deported or not even allowed to enter the country by the Coast Guard. And so while this is happening in the 1980s, you're already having ethnic and racial tensions. White Miamians feel like they are under siege by these darker people, and the police are acting as agents of the state and helping with deportation and controlling these darker skinned people. So you really have Miami in a situation where it's an all out race war in some respects. So this is the context that the Mcduffie uprising is happening in. And finally, question 4. So I would like to say here, my opinions expressed do not represent the National Park Service or anybody that works at the Park Service, but I am going to bring up President Trump because in the wake of George Floyd, he tweeted, it's now deleted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, so we are referencing Walter Headley. Walter Headley was the chief of police during the 1960s, and he enforced a stop and frisk campaign. We are all probably familiar with that, more so in the context of New York City, but it was already happening decades ago. And Walter Headley made it very clear that while he did not think the majority of the Negro population was a problem, those 10% that were young hoodlums and thugs needed to be dealt with, and he would meet violence with violence. And so that is also the context of a previous rebellion that occurred, Liberty City riots, that I unfortunately don't have time to get into, but you see during the 1960s and the war on poverty, a burgeoning war on crime and the expansion of the police state and the carceral system. And so when you as a Black person don't have access to resources or jobs, and the state is on your back stopping and frisking you, you're not going to be too happy. And that is the part of the context of the Mcduffie uprising, is the criminality forced onto Black bodies in Miami and obviously across the US. So lastly, just trying to, my thesis really tried to understand that the ability of law enforcement officers to kill with impunity is really part of a longer history in the United States, right? So we're talking about slave catchers during the Fugitive Slave Law, the ability of the KKK to infiltrate police forces. So a number of Miami police officers from the 1920s through the 1960s were active Ku Klux Klan members. But when we think of Miami as a tourist paradise, we also don't seem to recognize it as a Southern city with Southern roots, and the fact that it was built through Black labor. And so kind of exploring all of this, I hope to really kind of consolidate the conditions that made the Mcduffie Rebellion possible. And so what were my conclusions? Basically, the Cold War era complicity between the federal government and white Anglo power structure in Miami Latinized the area after Castro's revolution, resulting in a tri-ethnic racial hierarchy that further marginalized Blacks. While the influx of Cubans and other Spanish-speaking Latinos undermined the Black-white dichotomy endemic in South Florida at the time, an analysis of federal policy, law enforcement as social control, and discriminatory housing practices at all levels of government demonstrate a more complicated social history for Miami in the immediate and post-war era, rather than a triumphant story of civil rights as it has been framed. So I think that is probably it for my time. So I will stop sharing my screen. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Porsha, for your presentation. This brings us to the end of our second mini session, and now we're going to open up the floor to a couple more questions that are submitted through the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. The first question that we have is for Brandon. Brandon, you eloquently connect the relationships of male leaders of the CME Church with President Macleod Bethune. Please discuss the women leaders of the CME Church who were instrumental in the civil rights movement.
That's a good question. That's something I think my thesis was lacking. I didn't really focus on that, especially when you talk about the national movement. I know I can speak for Orlando, and that was one of the chapters in my thesis. A specific woman that attended the CME Church, Thelma Dudley, and she was very, very impactful on the movement, the local movement in Orlando. And I know she was instrumental in a lot of the desegregation of the school systems. So Thelma Dudley, and I was able, when I was doing my thesis research, I was able to interview two women in the church, Dr. Stewart, who was also a professor at UCF, and Ruth Settles, who was a secretary, and they gave me some good insight. And so I think it's something that'll continue to grow on me, especially as I'm here with Mary McLeod Bethune, and I didn't even touch on Mary McLeod Bethune really at all. It was just no time. But she was involved with the Methodist Church. Okay, she got the Methodist Church to pretty much fund Bethune-Cookman, and it's still affiliated with the Methodist Church today. But she was not necessarily a member. She didn't necessarily identify as a Methodist. So it's a very, very interesting relationship there when you talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and the Methodist Church. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Now we have a question for Porsha. It says, Porsha, great presentation. My question is, what influence, if any, do you think Black Lives Matter has on the conversation about police brutality? And what do you think guys like Kaepernick have caused? And do you think the guys like Kaepernick have caused
Kaepernick?
a shift? Yes, yes, sorry. Have caused a shift in the topic of police violence against African Americans?
Could you reread the first part of the question for me? Sorry.
It says, what question? Okay, it says, what influence, if any, do you think Black Lives Matter has had on the conversation about police brutality? And do you think guys like Kaepernick have caused a shift in the topic of police violence against African Americans?
Great question. I think the most succinct answer is yes. Black Lives Matter began in the wake of Mike Brown, the killing of Mike Brown in Missouri. And we've seen a shift in the way people talk about police violence and law enforcement. I mean, this past summer, you actually had people saying, defund the police, which would have been, I mean, that's something that's been said in abolitionist circles. But the fact that it entered into the mainstream speaks to what Black Lives Matter is not just a saying, but as a grassroots movement and organization has been able to shift that conversation. And so Kaepernick has played a huge role in that. I mean, I remember when he first took a knee and kneeled at a football game, and the girls were mad. And I mean, they're probably still very upset, but it's that shift and that transformation in people's, in public opinion and popular opinion about even just saying the term or the phrase Black Lives Matter has been interesting to watch. You see corporations doing it now. I think Mitt Romney said Black Lives Matter. I definitely didn't expect that from him. So yes, I think Black Lives Matter has shaped my own understanding of race, democracy, and policing in this country. And I would say that has done that for the vast majority of people as well. So thank you. Thank you for your question.
I want to apologize for butchering Kaepernick's name. I just want to go on the record and say, I'm sorry, world, about that. And so it's good to see everyone. And I just want to say thanks to our panel for participating in today's Lunch and Learn. It was wonderful hearing from everyone. And we hope that everyone found the information insightful. A big thank you to our audience on Zoom and on YouTube. And remember, this is being recorded, so it's available after the conclusion on YouTube. And thank you again for tuning in.